Alright, let's talk about one of the most elusive, mind-bending figures in the entire Warhammer 40k universe. Not a Primarch, not a Space Marine, not even someone most citizens of the Imperium would recognize by name. And yet without him, the Imperium as we know it would never have survived. I'm talking, of course, about Malcador the Sigillite. Now here's the thing. When most people think of Malcador, they picture this gaunt old man in tattered robes, standing silently beside the Emperor, always in the background, always watching. But if that's all you see, you're missing the whole story. Malcador wasn't just the Emperor's right hand. He was his mirror, his weapon, his contingency plan, and if you believe some theories, something even more ancient and terrifying than the Emperor himself. The more you dig into the fragments of lore, cryptic quotes, and forbidden texts, the more it starts to feel like Malcador was never meant to be understood. But that's what makes the mystery so irresistible. So who was he really? A loyal servant of mankind, a secret god in disguise, or maybe the true architect behind the galaxy-spanning empire that worships a corpse on a throne? Let's dive in. You'd think that someone who stood at the right hand of the Emperor during the most critical moments in humanity's history would have a well-documented background, right? But no. With Malcador, everything begins in mystery. He appears, fully formed and immensely powerful, already entrenched in the Emperor's inner circle before most people even realize who he is. There are no records of his childhood, no details about where he was born, or how he became what he was. Just silence, and that silence is deafening. One of the most persistent theories in the community is that Malcador wasn't just a powerful psyker, but something entirely different. Some fans call him a perpetual, and there is some evidence to support that. He hints, in one of the few moments we hear directly from him, that he's been alive for a very, very long time, longer than seems humanly possible. Perpetuals, of course, are rare, humans gifted or cursed with effective immortality. They regenerate, they endure, and they live across the ages. The Emperor is one. Vulcan, the Salamander's Primarch, is another. So could Malcador be part of that strange and select group? It would explain a lot. His wisdom, his patience, his ability to see the long game, not just over decades or centuries, but millennia. And yet, even among perpetuals, he's different. Stranger, more cloaked. There's another camp of fans who believe Malcador wasn't just a perpetual, but a first man, one of the original humans before the Age of Strife, perhaps even predating the Age of Terra. That would mean he's been walking the earth since before humanity became what it is today. This theory sees him less as a mere man and more as a relic of a forgotten era, a link to a version of humanity that was purer, more enlightened, or maybe more dangerous. In this view, Malcador represents what humanity was supposed to be before it fragmented into petty warlords and techno-barbarian cults. He's a fossil, yes, but a powerful one. But the theory that really sends chills down my spine, the one where Malcador isn't entirely human at all. Some whisper that he might be one of the last surviving Old Ones, those godlike beings from before the dawn of modern races, the manipulators who uplifted the Eldar and the Krorks. Now granted, that's pure tinfoil territory, but hear me out. Malcador's understanding of the warp, of fate, of psychic resonance, it goes beyond human. He speaks with a weight that suggests eons, not centuries. And the way he moves through the political and metaphysical realms of the Imperium, it feels less like someone navigating systems and more like someone who helped design them. Some versions of this theory soften the claim, saying he might not be an Old One himself, but rather a hybrid or someone blessed or cursed by their legacy. Maybe he was the result of some ancient experiment, or maybe he found knowledge he shouldn't have. Either way, there's a growing sense among fans that Malcador is not what he appears to be. There's just something off, like a puzzle piece that almost fits but doesn't quite. Then there are those who suggest that he is a psychic construct, something made by the Emperor himself. A shadow echo, an extension of the master of mankind's will. It would explain their uncanny connection, and how Malcador seems to always know what needs to be done, often without direct orders. But there's a sadness in that idea too. If Malcador wasn't ever real, then everything he suffered, his death, his sacrifice, was just part of a grand design. It robs him of agency, of humanity. And I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. Interestingly, Malcador himself never clarifies any of this. He speaks in riddles when he speaks at all. There's one moment that sticks with me, in the Siege of Terra novels, when he says he's older than the bones of the world. Now, is that metaphor? Or is that a glimpse of something deeper? Either way, he's not talking like a man. He's talking like a myth. And yet, in spite of all this speculation, we still know next to nothing. The official lore keeps it vague on purpose, and I kind of respect that. It allows Malcador to be whatever the story needs him to be. A sage, a monster, a martyr, or a mystery. And maybe that's the point. Maybe his origins are unknowable by design. Because if we did know the truth, maybe we'd realize he was never on our side at all. Or worse, maybe he was. And what that says about the Emperor's goals is something we're not ready to face. At the end of the day, Malcador remains a blank page wrapped in shadows. But whatever he was, perpetual, proto-human, godling, construct, he was something the galaxy had never seen before. And maybe something it won't see again. The thing that's always fascinated me the most about Malcador isn't just who he was, but how he fit into the Emperor's world. I mean, think about it. The Emperor had Primarchs, 20 demigod sons sculpted with divine purpose, each representing a fragment of his own psyche and power. And yet, when it came to true trust, to actual counsel, the Emperor turned not to his sons, but to Malcador. That alone tells you something is very different about this man. Their relationship isn't one of master and servant in the traditional sense. There's a subtlety to it. Malcador isn't constantly bowing and scraping, nor is he a yes man echoing everything the Emperor says. He disagrees, he advises, and sometimes he even challenges. There's a scene in the lore where he voices concern over the Primarch project, something few others would ever dare. Not because he was reckless, but because he could. Because he had the authority. And that raises a question fans have been circling for decades. Was Malcador just a trusted tool, or was he something more, an equal, a peer? Some believe that Malcador was the only one who truly understood the Emperor, not just as a ruler, but as a being. And maybe that's why the Emperor needed him. The Primarchs, for all their strength and brilliance, were children in many ways. They craved approval, rebelled against authority, and in some tragic cases collapsed under the weight of their own flaws. But Malcador, he was steady, grounded. He didn't need validation. He just did the work. That kind of reliability is rare, especially when you're playing a game on a galactic scale. There's this fan theory I love. It's not canon, but it sticks with you. The idea is that Malcador and the Emperor were the last survivors of an ancient cabal, perhaps even the final two remnants of some proto-human order that predated the Imperium by millennia. In that reading, they're not just allies. They're the last brothers standing in a world they once tried to save. That's why the Emperor confides in him. Not because Malcador is useful, but because he remembers. He's the only one who sees the full picture, who shares the burden. And then there's the emotional weight of it. It's easy to paint the Emperor as this cold, godlike entity who sees people as pawns. But with Malcador, there's this softness. As much as that word can exist in the grimdark universe, the Emperor entrusts Malcador with impossible responsibilities, overseeing Terra, assembling the Inquisition, sitting on the Golden Throne. These aren't just logistical decisions, they're acts of immense trust. The kind of trust you only give someone who is more than a servant, someone who is, in many ways, a reflection of yourself. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. Some argue that Malcador was just another tool in the Emperor's grand design, an intelligent, adaptable tool, but a tool nonetheless. They point to how the Emperor kept secrets from him, how he left him in the dark about certain aspects of the Webway project or the full nature of the Primarch's destinies. If Malcador were truly an equal, wouldn't he have been included in everything? But here's where it gets murky. The Emperor kept secrets from everyone. That was his nature. Even the Primarchs were fed half-truths and manipulated from the start. The fact that Malcador knew as much as he did might actually be more telling. In a regime built on absolute control and compartmentalized knowledge, Malcador stood out as someone who actually had a near-complete picture. That, in itself, is wild. There's another detail fans often overlook. Malcador was one of the few who called the Emperor by name, an act so rare and significant that it's been debated endlessly. Was it a sign of intimacy, arrogance, or a shared history deeper than we can guess? Either way, it was a line that no one else dared cross, and the Emperor never punished him for it. Their bond also had a practical edge. Malcador was the Emperor's fixer. When things got too messy, too tangled in politics, psychers, or metaphysics, Malcador stepped in. He made the hard calls, took the blame, bore the weight. There's a quote from him that always gives me chills. "I will be the monster if that is what you need me to be." That's not the voice of a servant. That's the voice of someone who understands the stakes at the deepest level and accepts them fully. It's tempting to think of Malcador as a shadow, always lurking just behind the throne. But I don't think that's accurate. He was the throne in many ways. While the Emperor was out waging wars and crafting divine plans, Malcador kept the gears turning. He was the administrator of humanity's ascension, and that's no small role. So, was he an equal? I think yes, but not in the sense of power or scale. The Emperor was a being of godlike magnitude, after all. But in purpose, in insight, in trust? Absolutely. Malcador wasn't just trusted to carry out orders. He was trusted to make decisions in the Emperor's absence. And if that doesn't scream peer, I don't know what does. In the end, their relationship was probably the most honest connection either of them had in that whole tragic saga. No manipulation, no betrayal, no fall from grace. Just two ancient minds fighting to keep humanity from devouring itself, even if it meant becoming monsters to do it. Here's where things get even more fascinating. If you strip away the myth, the mystery, and the whispers of ancient power, what you're left with is this. Malcador the Sigillite didn't just help build the Imperium. He designed its bones, its nervous system, its entire bureaucratic and spiritual architecture. While the Emperor was busy being the visionary, the warrior god striding across battlefields and webway projects, Malcador was behind the curtain, turning a vision into a machine that could actually function. And it's kind of wild how little credit he gets for it. Let's talk about the Adeptus Terra for a moment. Everyone knows it today as the backbone of imperial governance. This massive, sprawling network that manages everything from planetary tithes to military logistics. But it didn't just spring up overnight. Someone had to sketch out that system, codify the rules, make sure that when the Emperor turned his focus to other, more esoteric projects, there was still someone keeping the stars in line. That someone was Malcador. He wasn't just managing things temporarily. He was building a structure that would endure for 10,000 years, and frankly, he pulled it off a little too well. There's this sense in the lore that Malcador always understood the scale of what they were creating. While the Emperor had the long-term vision of a united psychic humanity, Malcador was the one actually solving the problems of governance, stability, and enforcement. He knew you couldn't hold a million worlds together just by will or ideology. You needed systems, offices, chains of command, redundancy, and maybe most importantly, fear. The High Lords of Terra? That's Malcador's legacy. He laid the groundwork for their authority, even if he probably would have hated what they eventually became. Stagnant, paranoid, self-serving bureaucrats. But in the beginning, the idea made sense. You needed people to carry on the Emperor's will in his absence. Malcador might have hoped they'd be philosopher kings. Instead, they turned into paranoid aristocrats. That's the tragedy of delegation, right? You can build a perfect structure, but you can't control the rot once it sets in. And then there's the Inquisition. This part gets really intense, because it's where you realize just how far Malcador was willing to go. The Inquisition wasn't some impulsive reaction to the heresy. It was a contingency he planned. He handpicked its founders, individuals like Promius and Moriana, people he knew would carry on the Emperor's true will, even if it meant rooting out corruption with fire and blade. Malcador saw what was coming. He understood that the greatest threats wouldn't always come from the outside. Sometimes they'd wear the face of a friend, or hide in the warp, or grow inside the ecclesiarchy's own temples. Some fans argue that this was his greatest sin, that he created a monster that now devours innocence in the name of purity. But honestly, I get it. If I had seen what Malcador saw, demons breaking reality, gods clawing at the edge of sanity, I might have done the same. He didn't build the Inquisition for glory. He built it because he knew there was no other choice. And that kind of cold clarity? It's both terrifying and awe-inspiring. One of the most overlooked aspects of his legacy, though, is his role in shaping Imperial navigation. Before the Astronomicon was fully operational, the galaxy was a nightmare of warp storms and unpredictability. The Emperor had the vision of the Astronomicon, but Malcador helped turn that vision into a functioning reality. He coordinated the psychic infrastructure, aligned the various psyker orders, and helped build the framework that would allow navigators to do their jobs. He understood that without reliable warp travel, everything else, the Crusade, the expansion, the Imperium itself, would fall apart. And so, once again, he made sure it worked. Some say Malcador was the first true Grand Master of the Administratum, the hidden hand that moved all the pieces on the board. He didn't just react to crises, he preempted them. He created institutions, filled them with loyal agents, and then set them loose. It's easy to forget that while Horus and his brothers were waging war on each other, Malcador was still on Terra, holding the damn galaxy together. He didn't need a bolter. His weapon was order. Of course, that leads to another fan theory, the idea that Malcador didn't just build the Imperium we know, but actively shaped it into what it would become. That maybe he foresaw the grimdark future and accepted it as inevitable. Some even go so far as to suggest that Malcador chose authoritarianism because he believed it was the only way humanity could survive. That deep down, he didn't believe in a bright future of enlightenment, but in control through fear and sacrifice. That theory makes my skin crawl a bit, to be honest, because it makes him look less like a savior and more like a cold strategist playing the long game. But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe Malcador wasn't trying to be a hero. Maybe he knew that heroes die and legends fade, but structures endure. Maybe he gave up his humanity so the Imperium could keep its own, however twisted and broken it became. It's strange to think about how much of our current understanding of the Imperium, its rules, its institutions, even its religion, can be traced back to the hands of this one man. Not a Primarch, not a god, just Malcador, writing edicts, sealing scrolls, positioning agents like pieces on a galaxy-sized board. That's what makes his story so compelling. He didn't need the spotlight. He was the foundation. And maybe that's why, even now, so many in-universe scholars and fan theorists alike obsess over him. Because buried beneath all the fire and fury of the Imperium lies a blueprint, and Malcador was the one who drew it. When people talk about the Great Crusade, the spotlight naturally falls on the Primarchs. These towering demigods, each leading their legions across the stars, bringing countless worlds into compliance. It's hard not to be dazzled by that kind of mythic grandeur. But while Horus and Guilliman and the rest were out there conquering, there was someone else ensuring that the Imperium didn't tear itself apart from the inside. Someone who didn't wear armor or wield a thunderhammer, but whose influence shaped the entire crusade from behind the curtain. That someone, of course, was Malcador. It's easy to forget that conquest is only half the battle. What comes after the fighting? Governance, diplomacy, reconstruction, that's where empires are truly forged. And Malcador understood that better than anyone. While the Emperor directed the Crusade's spiritual and scientific ambitions, and the Primarchs executed the military campaigns, Malcador was busy doing something just as crucial, holding together the messy, chaotic political infrastructure of a newborn Imperium. He wasn't out there burning heretics or toppling alien empires. He was at Terra, and sometimes just beyond it, weaving a web of control, compromise, and calculated deceit to make sure that the Emperor's vision didn't fall apart before it had a chance to solidify. He had to work with planetary governors, Mechanicum officials, rogue traders, and yes, even the Primarchs themselves, each with their own agendas, egos, and power bases. And you better believe that wasn't easy. The Primarchs might have been created to be loyal, but that didn't mean they were obedient. They were competitive, prideful, and sometimes outright rebellious. There's this idea floating around the fandom that Malcador's real job wasn't managing humanity. It was managing the Emperor's sons. And honestly, it checks out. Take Lorgar, for instance. The moment his religious tendencies started bubbling up, who do you think was there to remind the Emperor of the dangers of unchecked zealotry? Malcador. Or at least, that's what many fans believe. He had his fingers on the pulse of these slow-burn catastrophes long before they exploded. He didn't have the luxury of ignoring warning signs. He saw the fault lines forming, the ideological rifts, and he did what he could to smooth them over, or suppress them when necessary. And then there's his role in the unification of Terra and the early dealings with Mars. People forget just how tense those negotiations were. The Emperor needed the Mechanicum, but the Mechanicum had their own gods, their own cults, their own horrifying ideas about technology and divinity. Somehow, a deal was struck. And while the Emperor gets the credit for the Treaty of Mars, it's not hard to imagine Malcador being the one who actually brokered the terms behind the scenes, drafting compromises, threatening consequences, twisting just enough arms to make the pieces fall into place. He wasn't a warmonger, but he knew how to play the game of power. In fact, I'd argue that Malcador was the only one in the early Imperium who understood just how dangerous politics could be, not just among human factions, but among ideologies, traditions, and belief systems that couldn't easily coexist. He wasn't afraid to lie, to bribe, to threaten. And that's what makes him both brilliant and kind of terrifying. He had this uncanny ability to do exactly what needed to be done, even if it meant walking a line so fine you couldn't tell if he was still on the side of righteousness. But there's a cost to that kind of work. Fans often debate whether Malcador lost something of himself during those years. Whether, in trying to maintain control, he had to bury parts of his own conscience. There are rumors, never confirmed of course, that he sanctioned silent purges within the imperial bureaucracy, that he allowed certain rebellions to simmer just long enough to justify tighter control, that he let entire populations suffer so the broader machine could keep running smoothly. It's all speculation, but in the grimdark universe of Warhammer, where morality bends under the weight of survival, it doesn't seem out of character. One of the most interesting theories I've seen is that Malcador was constantly at odds with the concept of the Imperium itself. That while he served the Emperor's vision, he didn't always agree with the methods. That deep down, he believed in a more enlightened form of unity, one based on knowledge and reason rather than fear and violence. And yet, when push came to shove, he still enforced the Emperor's will. Not because he loved tyranny, but because he saw no alternative. That internal conflict, if true, makes his actions during the Crusade even more tragic. He might have been trying to build something better, but found himself laying the foundations of a nightmare instead. What's undeniable is that Malcador was a master of manipulation, but not in a cartoonish, villainous way. His manipulations were subtle, elegant. He didn't bark orders or throw his weight around. He whispered in the right ears. He planted ideas. He made people think they were making their own decisions. That kind of influence is more potent than any force sword or bolter round. And it's exactly what the Imperium needed at that stage. Someone who could see the bigger picture and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty to protect it. And the truth is, we'll never know the full extent of his involvement. Malcador operated in shadows, and those shadows were deliberate. He erased records, sealed documents, covered his tracks not to glorify himself, but to protect the integrity of the systems he was building. He didn't need to be remembered. He just needed the Imperium to survive. But that survival came with a price. The cost of compromise, of manipulation, of countless unseen sacrifices. And Malcador paid it in full. Without ever raising a banner or making a speech, he became the scaffolding of a galactic empire. And most of the people he saved never even knew his name. The Horus Heresy was, without a doubt, the bloodiest and most heart-wrenching conflict in the history of the Imperium. Brother turned on brother, sons betrayed their father, and entire worlds were reduced to ashes in the name of ambition and vengeance. And while the battles raged across the stars, while titans clashed and legions died screaming, Malcador remained on Terra, calm, calculating, and terrifyingly effective. This wasn't just the loyal administrator holding the line. This was Malcador the Sigillite, unleashed in the only battlefield he ever needed, the world of secrets, psychers, and psychological warfare. When the heresy broke out, many expected Malcador to simply maintain Terra's defenses, to act as the Emperor's steward while he worked on the Golden Throne. But what actually happened was far more complex. Malcador became the Imperium's shadow general, not in a flashy, overt way, but in the background, pulling strings, sending agents, manipulating events in ways that even now remain obscured. And honestly, I think that's where his true genius revealed itself. He wasn't commanding fleets, but he was doing something arguably more important, holding the idea of the Imperium together while it was being torn apart. Let's start with his use of psychers. During the heresy, humanity's psychic potential was still an unpredictable force, raw and often dangerous. And yet Malcador saw opportunity in that chaos. He gathered hundreds, maybe thousands of psychers, some trained, many not, and forged them into a secret weapon. The Scholastica Psychana was his creation, a precursor to the modern-day Astra Telepathica, but its roots were drenched in desperation. He pulled these individuals in, molded them, used them as tools, not just for communication or combat, but for something deeper. Spying, counter-subversion, disinformation campaigns. He understood that psychers could see through lies, read intent, even influence the minds of traitors before they struck. There are accounts, fragmented and scattered, that suggest Malcador didn't hesitate to sacrifice these psychers when needed. They were resources, weapons, batteries to be burned if it meant gaining an edge against the War Master. And yes, that sounds cold. But when you're trying to stop a civil war that threatens to collapse an entire species, mercy becomes a luxury you can't afford. I've seen fans argue that Malcador became too comfortable with these sacrifices, that he crossed a line from pragmatist to monster. And maybe they're right. But part of me wonders if he ever had a choice. Then there's the way he handled the loyalist forces. Malcador didn't just support them, he directed them. He sent cryptic orders, funneled information, and in some cases, deliberately withheld key facts to keep things from spiraling even further out of control. It's said that he manipulated Dorn into certain defensive strategies, not because they were tactically perfect, but because they served a longer-term purpose, buying time for the Emperor to complete his work beneath the palace. That's the kind of thinking that gets people killed, and he knew it. But perhaps the most haunting example of Malcador's ruthlessness during the heresy was what he did to Terra itself. Billions of citizens lived on the throne world during those years, and as the siege loomed closer, Malcador made brutal decisions to ensure Terra could survive the coming storm. Entire city blocks were sealed off. Populations were relocated or purged based on perceived loyalty or psychic risk. The Black Sentinels, his personal enforcers, were given free rein to eliminate threats before they could bloom. It was security through absolute control, and it shattered countless lives. But again, in his eyes, what was the alternative? And then there's the theory, one I can't stop thinking about, that Malcador may have known the heresy was inevitable. Not just suspected, but known. There are whispers that he allowed certain events to unfold, even nudged them along, to force the Imperium into becoming what it needed to be. That he saw the Emperor's dream was too fragile, too idealistic, and that it needed to be reforged in fire. If that's true, then the heresy wasn't just a tragedy, it was a transformation, and Malcador was its silent architect. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That while billions died, while legions burned and worlds fell, Malcador was playing a longer game, not for glory, not for power, but for stability, for the survival of the species. He saw the edge of the abyss and decided it was worth pushing a few people in if it meant the rest could step back. That's not heroism, that's not villainy, that's something far harder to define. And yet, I can't bring myself to hate him for it, because in every account, every shadowed whisper of his actions during the heresy, there's this constant. He never once stopped serving the Imperium. Not himself, not his legacy, just the cause. The cold, burning idea that humanity had to endure, no matter the price. Some call him a martyr, others a monster. But what I see is a man who understood that when gods go to war, someone has to clean up the fallout. And in the darkest days of the heresy, that someone was Malcador. Not with a sword, but with silence, sacrifice, and secrets. When you really start to peel back the layers of Malcador's actions, especially during the heresy and its chaotic aftermath, you start running into decisions that don't just blur the line between right and wrong, they utterly erase it. The same man who held the Imperium together also made choices that are hard to justify, even in a galaxy built on horror. And that's what makes Malcador such a compelling figure. He wasn't clean. He wasn't noble in the traditional sense. In fact, in many ways, he was just as frightening as the Emperor himself, maybe even more so because his monstrosity wasn't wrapped in divine distance. It was human, coldly, terrifyingly human. Let's talk about the forgotten powers he toyed with. There are fragments of lore, barely acknowledged in canon, but whispered about in fan circles, that suggest Malcador had access to knowledge even the Emperor had buried. Ancient texts from the Dark Age of technology, fragments of Xenos grimoires, psychic rituals that predated the Imperium by tens of thousands of years. And he didn't just study them, he used them, quietly, efficiently, with terrifying precision. Some say he kept entire vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, filled with things that were never meant to be remembered, let alone touched. Warp-mapped star charts, techno-arcana fusions, even bound demon fragments. Not out of curiosity, but because he believed he needed every possible tool to win the coming war. That kind of pragmatic desperation, using the very powers the Imperium would later outlaw completely, puts him in a moral gray zone most characters never touch. The irony, of course, is that he helped lay the foundations for the Inquisition, an organization that would burn others alive for even hearing of the things he once wielded. And that raises the uncomfortable question. Was Malcador the exception because he was trusted or because he was necessary? Did he break the rules because he could, or because the rules didn't exist until he wrote them? And then there are the purges. Oh, the purges. Entire proto-orders of psychers, scholars, and even loyalist factions were wiped out under his command, often in the name of stability. There's the story of the Disciples of the Unseen Path, an early psyker collective that had pledged itself to Malcador's guidance. They vanished overnight. Official records say they were destroyed by chaos infiltration, but some fan theories suggest Malcador himself gave the order, afraid they'd grown too powerful, too independent. It wasn't about corruption. It was about control. And when that control slipped, he didn't hesitate to pull the trigger. That's the side of Malcador people don't like to talk about. The one who chose cold efficiency over loyalty, secrecy over transparency, silence over redemption. But it's there, baked into every action. He didn't just fight chaos. He studied it. He understood that the warp couldn't be ignored. It had to be mapped, watched, engaged. There's a deeply disturbing theory that he may have even allowed certain minor demonic incursions to occur under controlled circumstances, just to test response protocols or to study how they operated. If that's true, then it means he was willing to gamble with lives on a scale that makes your skin crawl. And yet, somehow, you can almost understand it. Because this was war on a scale beyond comprehension. There's also this creeping suspicion among some fans that Malcador didn't just fight against the ruinous powers. He spoke with them, not out of corruption, but diplomacy. It sounds insane at first, but the logic is seductive. If the gods of the warp are ancient, sentient energies driven by thought and emotion, wouldn't it make sense to try and understand them? Maybe even negotiate with them? Not to surrender, but to delay, to mislead, to manipulate them the way he manipulated everyone else. It's a theory with no hard proof, but the implications are terrifying. What if the reason Malcador burned out on the Golden Throne wasn't just because he was powerful, but because he was tainted? And that brings us to the big comparison. Was Malcador as terrifying as the Emperor? On the surface, no. The Emperor was a being of raw psychic supremacy, a force of will so overwhelming that people mistook him for a god. Malcador was a man, but that's the thing. The Emperor had to be above morality. He couldn't afford weakness, couldn't waste time with empathy. But Malcador chose to make those same kinds of decisions without the excuse of godhood. That's what makes him so haunting. He saw the consequences. He felt the weight. And he still did it. In some ways, that makes him more dangerous. Because if Malcador, a man with a soul, could justify those actions, then it means anyone could. He was the blueprint for the Inquisitor who turns on a planet to save a sector. The proto-model for the High Lord who sacrifices billions for the greater good. He wasn't corrupted by chaos. He was corrupted by necessity. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all. And yet, I can't bring myself to fully condemn him, because someone had to make those calls. Someone had to be the one who looked into the warp and didn't flinch. Malcador was that someone, not because he was fearless, but because he understood fear better than anyone. He didn't want to become the monster. He just knew someone had to play the part. And so, piece by piece, decision by decision, he built himself into something the Imperium needed, whether it wanted it or not. Was he a monster? Maybe. Was he the last light in a galaxy falling into shadow? Maybe that too. That's the tragedy of Malcador. He didn't become what he was out of ambition or madness. He became it out of love. Love for humanity, twisted and scorched as it might have been. And that's what makes him one of the most terrifying figures in all of Warhammer. Not because he was evil, but because he was right. There's this unspoken assumption in Warhammer lore that Psykers, no matter how powerful, are ultimately at the mercy of the warp. The Imperium is chaos incarnate, raw, emotional, violent, and utterly untamable. Even the Emperor, for all his might, walks a razor's edge when it comes to mastering it. So when you hear that Malcador was one of the most powerful Psykers to have ever lived, it's natural to assume he was just riding that same storm. Skilled, sure, but still just another mortal trying to tame a tide meant for gods. But what if that's not the case? What if Malcador wasn't just surviving the warp, but shaping it? I've always found it strange how little the official lore wants to talk about Malcador's psychic feats. We get whispers. He stood in for the Emperor on the Golden Throne. He guided fleets with his mind. He moved through warp storms like they were mist. But the scope of what that really means is often glossed over. Think about it. Sitting on the Golden Throne, even for a moment, would tear most Psykers apart. The throne isn't just a chair. It's a psychic relay connected to the Astronomicon and the Webway. It's a god machine built to channel impossible energies. And Malcador held it, not for seconds, not for minutes, for hours. And he didn't just survive, he functioned. That alone puts him in a category beyond anything we usually see, even among the Emperor's chosen. Some fans go further. They believe that Malcador wasn't just a Psyker, but something closer to a warp construct himself. a being whose existence was partly anchored in the Imperium, much like the demons he fought against. Not corrupted, not chaotic, but fundamentally tied to the warp in a way that gave him control most psychers could only dream of. There's no concrete proof of this, of course, but there are these small hints scattered throughout the lore. References to how people near him would feel their thoughts subtly shift, how reality seemed thinner in his presence, how he could sense when things were about to happen. These aren't just signs of psychic talent, they're signs of attunement. One theory I love, though it borders on the metaphysical, is that Malcador didn't just use the warp. He understood it, not as a weapon or a threat, but as a language. While most psychers lash out with brute force, bolts of fire, psychic screams, Malcador was more like a poet or a surgeon. He moved through the warp with purpose, not violence, and maybe that's why he was so dangerous, because he didn't fear the warp the way others did. He listened to it, and in listening, he learned its secrets. There's even speculation that he was able to construct psychic barriers and illusions so subtle, even the demons couldn't detect them. That he could cloud the perceptions of warp entities, not just humans. That he built entire mental mazes in the minds of his enemies, traps that would unravel over days, weeks, even years. These sound like tall tales, but in a setting where the line between thought and reality is paper thin, is it really that far-fetched? And then there's the idea that he may have been able to see through the warp, not just glimpses, but full multidimensional visions of potential futures. Like the Emperor, Malcador might have glimpsed branching timelines, alternate outcomes, and fates that could be twisted with the smallest nudge. That's the level we're talking about here, not just psychic attacks, but reality manipulation. Some fans believe that his quiet demeanor wasn't stoicism, it was restraint. That at any moment he could have torn holes in the fabric of the warp, but chose not to, because he knew the cost. It also makes you wonder, how much of what happened during the heresy did Malcador allow because he saw it coming? Maybe he wasn't just reacting to events. Maybe he was orchestrating probabilities, subtly influencing the warp to ensure certain outcomes, not because he had absolute power, but because he understood how to tilt things just enough. If that's true, then his connection to the warp isn't just impressive, it's terrifying. But this brings us to the dark side of that power, because to work so closely with the warp, to know it so intimately, is to risk being changed by it. And while Malcador never fell, you have to wonder what it cost him. He was never the same after sitting on the throne. He burned out, not just physically, but psychically. Like someone who had walked too far into the fire and carried the scars inside. Maybe he saw things, truths about the warp, about the Emperor, about humanity itself, that broke something in him. Maybe that's why he always seemed so tired, so hollow, not because he was weak, but because he had seen too much. There's this idea that Malcador, in his final days, wasn't even fully present anymore. That part of him had already slipped into the warp, existing as a ghost or a shadow, whispering back to the material world through dreams or intuition. It's the kind of theory that makes you pause and re-examine everything he did. Was he still human by the end? Or was he becoming something else? Something between the warp and the real? Something that might still linger just beyond the veil? What I love most about these theories isn't that they try to turn Malcador into some invincible super being. It's that they treat his power as quiet, as precise, not a hammer but a scalpel. And in the world of Warhammer, where everything is exaggerated and brutal, that kind of subtlety feels almost divine, or at least as close to divine as a mortal mind can reach without breaking. So, was he just a psyker? No, I don't think so. I think Malcador was something rarer, a man who didn't just wield the warp, but who understood it, who treated it not as a curse or a tool, but as a part of reality that could be bent, not broken. And maybe, just maybe that's why he never feared it the way others did, because he was part of it. There's a moment in every great story when the character you thought you knew finally shows you who they really are. For Malcador, that moment wasn't in a grand speech or a final battle. It was in the quiet, terrible stillness of the Golden Throne. The Emperor, shattered and broken after his duel with Horus, barely clinging to existence, had to be installed on the throne to survive. But there was a problem. The throne couldn't just be activated like a switch. It needed a conduit, a buffer, a soul strong enough to hold the raw fury of the warp at bay. Malcador knew this, and without hesitation he sat down. It's hard to overstate how insane that act was. The Golden Throne isn't just a machine, it's a multi-dimensional crucible of psychic energy. It channels the Astronomicon, holds the webway breach closed, and anchors the Emperor's soul in real space. Even the Emperor himself is only barely able to endure it. For anyone else, even the most gifted psyker, it should be an instant death sentence. But Malcador didn't just sit on it. He held it for hours. Long enough to stabilize the entire system, long enough to give the Emperor a chance to survive, and in doing so, he sacrificed everything he had left. We don't have a vivid moment-by-moment account of what happened inside the throne room. The records are sparse, cloaked in ritual and censorship. But what we do know paints a picture of absolute, soul-rending agony. Malcador's body was reportedly reduced to ash and dust. His psychic signature, which had once lit up like a star in the warp, vanished completely. Some say his soul was consumed, others that it was scattered across the Imperium. A few theorists even believe that a fragment of him remains inside the throne itself, still silently aiding the Emperor. And honestly, that wouldn't surprise me, because here's the thing. Malcador knew exactly what would happen. This wasn't a heroic impulse. This wasn't a moment of rash courage. It was a cold, clear decision made by someone who had been preparing for this possibility for a long, long time. He understood the consequences. He saw the weight of what was at stake, and he chose to die anyway. And that, for me, is the moment when Malcador stops being a manipulator or a spy master, or even just the Emperor's right hand. That's the moment he becomes something more, not a god, not a martyr, but a man who gave every last part of himself to preserve a dream that was already crumbling. He didn't die in battle. He didn't leave behind an empire carved in his image. He died alone, in silence, keeping the galaxy from falling apart for just a few moments longer. Some fans see this as proof of Malcador's purity, that despite all the gray decisions, the manipulations, the atrocities, deep down, he remained loyal, that he always believed in the Emperor's vision, even if he didn't agree with every method. Others see it differently. They argue that this final act was penance, that Malcador knew what he'd done, how many he'd sacrificed, how deeply he'd compromised his soul, and that this was the only way to balance the scale. Not to redeem himself exactly, but to ensure his story ended on his own terms. I don't think it has to be one or the other. That's the beauty of Malcador. He's not a clean character. His motivations were layered, messy, human. Maybe he believed in the dream and still hated what it had become. Maybe he wanted to save the Emperor and still resented being the one to do it. Maybe he went to the throne, not because he wanted to, but because he knew no one else would. And that's what makes it such a powerful moment. Not just that he died, but that he chose to die when he could have easily let someone else take his place. There's a line from one of the old texts, possibly apocryphal but deeply poetic, that says, "He burned not in fire, but in duty. He was the last of us who remembered why we fought." Whether it's real or not, it sticks with me, because that's how I see Malcador's final act. Not as a blaze of glory, but as a quiet, brutal act of love. Not love for the Emperor necessarily, but love for humanity. For the chance, however slim, that something might survive. And the tragedy is, most of the Imperium doesn't even remember him. His name is spoken in hushed tones, buried in arcane titles. Statues of him are rare. Stories about him are rarer. But in that final moment when the galaxy stood on the edge of collapse, it wasn't a Primarch or a saint who stepped forward. It was a tired old man who had already given everything and gave a little more. Was it worth it? I don't know. The Imperium that rose from the ashes of the Heresy is a brutal, decaying empire locked in endless war. But maybe, just maybe, without Malcador's sacrifice, there wouldn't be anything left at all. Maybe in that final act, we see his true nature, not as a weapon or a monster or a mystery, but as a man who chose to carry the weight so others wouldn't have to. And that, in this grim and broken universe, might be the most heroic thing of all. Malcador's legacy is a strange, unsettling thing. In a galaxy that thrives on saints, martyrs, and mythical heroes, his name is whispered more than it's praised. There are no grand holidays in his honor, no cathedrals raised to his memory, no warrior cults swearing oaths in his name. And yet everything, the entire damned Imperium, still runs on the machinery he designed. His hands are all over it. The institutions, the doctrines, the silences, the things we take for granted as the natural order of the Imperium were in truth engineered by a single man with a mind like a knife and a will that bent history itself. That's the paradox of Malcador. He shaped a future he knew would forget him. But forgetting isn't the same as erasing. The High Lords of Terra still operate from the foundations he laid. The Inquisition, in all its terrible glory, is still animated by his vision of vigilance, paranoid, merciless, watching the stars for threats no one else can comprehend. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, there are still black vaults and sealed archives that only bear one name, Malcador. He's not gone. He's just behind the walls now. A presence in the structure, like the echo of someone who never really left. What's always struck me as fascinating is how differently people talk about him depending on where they stand in the Imperium's hierarchy. For the common citizen, those lucky enough to even hear his name, he's a ghost story, a wraith who once stood beside the Emperor in the days before time, a figure too distant to love and too shadowed to fear. But for those closer to the center, for the Inquisitors, the Archivists, the Psychers, Malcador is something else entirely. He's a warning, a reminder that power must be guided, not just wielded, that secrets have weight, that the line between protector and puppet master is thinner than anyone likes to admit. There's a persistent rumor among the Inquisition that Malcador didn't just establish them, he left behind messages, not teachings, not doctrines, but literal hidden instructions scattered across time and space. Keys, they call them, keys to something greater. Some say they're contingency plans, protocols for when the Emperor finally dies. Others believe they're part of a resurrection effort, that Malcador foresaw the Emperor's failure and laid out a path for rebuilding something new from the ashes. And then there are the darker theories, the ones that claim Malcador left behind weapons, ideas, people, elements of himself, hidden in psychic caches or cloned in secret vaults, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. I don't know if I believe all of that. It sounds more like hopeful myth than grounded lore. But what I do believe is that Malcador wasn't the kind of man to just walk away from the future. He planned. He prepared. Every move he made was layered with intention. And it's hard to accept that someone like that would just let go, especially knowing the state of the Imperium we live with now, stagnant, brutal, devouring itself. Malcador had to know this was coming. The rot, the decay, the blind worship of a dead emperor. And it's hard to believe he didn't at least try to plant seeds for something better. Whether those seeds will ever bloom, that's another story. What's really chilling is the way his methods have become normalized. We don't even question them anymore. The purges, the silencing of dissent, the use of psychic torture in interrogation, the quiet erasure of those who know too much. We call it imperial tradition, but it's really Malcador's tradition. He built an empire that could survive without its god, and in doing so, he may have made sure it would never change. Some fans argue that's his greatest failure, that he created a system too rigid, too reliant on fear and silence, that in trying to preserve hope, he accidentally mummified it. But others see it differently. They say Malcador was the last man who understood the Imperium, not as it was or as it pretended to be, but as it truly functioned. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't pretend the bureaucracy would ever be noble. He just made sure it would work, that it would endure. And in this galaxy, maybe that's the best anyone can do. Not build a utopia, but build something that won't collapse when the next apocalypse comes knocking. There's this fan theory I adore, completely unverified, totally speculative, but it gives me chills. The idea is that Malcador isn't dead, not entirely, that his soul, scorched and shattered by the Golden Throne, was bound into some hidden mechanism deep beneath the palace, not alive, not conscious, but dreaming, watching, waiting for the day when the galaxy needs him again, not to rule, not to speak, but to guide, subtly, gently, like a whisper in the back of someone's mind who's about to make a decision that could change everything. It sounds like fantasy, I know, but when you look at how many crises the Imperium has survived against all odds, how many close calls have been averted at the last second, you start to wonder, maybe there's still a shadow on the chessboard. A final hand nudging pieces when no one's looking. What Malcador left behind isn't just a legacy. It's a challenge, a reminder that real leadership isn't about glory or purity or even power. It's about burden, the willingness to carry the weight no one else will touch, and the terrifying clarity to know when that weight needs to crush someone else to keep the rest standing. In a way, the Imperium today is the greatest testament to his brilliance and his tragedy. It endures, yes, but it's hollow, joyless, afraid of its own reflection. And maybe, just maybe, Malcador knew that would happen. Maybe he accepted that his masterpiece would survive not as a beacon, but as a fortress. Cold, monolithic, eternal, a monument not to victory but to endurance. And somewhere in that I think he hoped, prayed even, that someone someday would find the courage to finish what he started. So, after all that, after tracing the path of Malcador through the darkest corridors of the Imperium's history, from the shadows of the Unification Wars to the blinding agony of the Golden Throne, we're still left with the same question we started with. Who was he? A god among men? A calculating monster in service of a greater good? Or was he simply the last man left standing when everyone else had either fallen or given up? The answer, frustratingly, is all of the above, and none of it. Malcador the Sigillite defies simple labels because he was never designed to fit into one. He wasn't a warrior, yet he fought wars of his own. He wasn't a saint, yet he sacrificed more than most in the name of humanity. He wasn't a tyrant, but he made decisions that would chill the blood of any moral philosopher. Everything he did, every whisper in the ear of a Primarch, every erased name, every psyker broken for the sake of Terra, was part of a larger calculus. And that's what makes him so endlessly fascinating. He's not a story of heroism or villainy. He's a story of necessity. Some fans believe Malcador was the Emperor's final check, his conscience. The last human voice reminding a god why humanity mattered. But others argue the opposite, that Malcador was the one who gave up on idealism first, that he saw the failure coming before the heresy even began, and started laying the groundwork for a future based not on enlightenment, but on control. That in trying to preserve the Imperium, he made it inevitable that it would become a cage. Personally, I think he was the last friend the Emperor had. The only one who wasn't built by him or blindly worshipped him. The one who chose to stay. And that choice, in a universe where loyalty is so often bred or enforced, is everything. He wasn't bound by gene seed or programmed purpose. He stayed beside the Emperor because he believed, truly believed, in something worth preserving. That belief might have twisted over time, hardened into ruthlessness, but it never vanished. There's this haunting contrast between him and the Primarchs. They were created to be perfect, but most of them broke under the weight of expectation. Malcador, by comparison, was imperfect from the start, human, fragile, limited, and yet he never wavered. That's part of why his story hits so hard, because it isn't about destiny. It's about choice. Every act of cruelty, every sacrifice, every final breath he gave on the throne, that was his. He owned it all. Some theorize that the Emperor saw a part of himself in Malcador, maybe even a version of who he might have been had he not become a living god. And maybe that's why he trusted him so deeply. Because where others failed through hubris, Malcador succeeded through humility. Not weakness, restraint. In a universe of egos, Malcador knew when to step back, when to disappear, when to die. Even now, 10,000 years later, his name lingers like an echo, not shouted from the pulpits like a saint, not cursed like a traitor, but remembered, quietly, carefully, as if the galaxy itself knows that something vast and vital passed through it and isn't quite sure what remains. I've read fans debate endlessly over what Malcador's role should have been. Should he have taken over after the Emperor fell? Should he have passed on everything he knew instead of locking it away? Should he have tried to reform the Imperium, not just preserve it? And maybe those are fair questions, but I think the truth is more complicated. Malcador didn't see himself as a ruler. He saw himself as the last custodian of a fading hope, a man with too many ghosts behind him and only one path left in front. Was he a dark genius? Yeah, probably. Was he a hero? In the grimmest, most broken sense of the word. Was he a god? No, he was worse. He was a man who understood gods. And in that understanding, he chose to stand beside one, not in worship, but in solidarity. And maybe that's what we're left with in the end. Not a clear picture, not a simple judgment, but a puzzle in the shape of a man. A story told in shadows, secrets, and sacrifice. Malcador the Sigillite wasn't meant to be loved. He wasn't meant to be followed. He was meant to be understood. Or at least, tried. So now it's your turn. After everything we've looked at, his origins, his power, his sins, his sacrifice, what do you think? Was Malcador a savior, a monster, a victim of circumstance? Or something stranger still? Something we don't even have the words for? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your theories, your takes, your debates. Was Malcador humanity's last light or its first tyrant? And if you enjoyed this journey through his legacy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more lore deep dives into the twisted brilliance of the Warhammer universe. There's always another shadow to chase.